the fear of commercial property investing. Now, if you have not invested into commercial property, perhaps you also have that fear. But let me tell you something, that even after buying so many commercial properties for us, for our clients, I can tell you one thing, that we also have the same fear, because it's a human emotion, and humans are always, every time I want to buy a commercial property, sign that, put up the offer, I ask the same question, that is this right? Am I making mistakes? So this fear will always be there. In this video, I am going to talk about how you can overcome those fears, and what are the top 3 fears that people generally have when they come to commercial property investing. If you want to know, then stick around. Alright, so what is the number one fear that people have when it comes to the commercial property investing? Now, residential property investing is slightly different because it's a larger pool, it is easy to understand. Commercial is slightly different. So the number one fear for commercial property investing that people have is, what if my tenant moves out? That's the number one fear. Like, the property will be vacant and I am not going to find any more tenant, and all of a sudden, like, this property, the value of that property will become zero, like literally zero. This is how people are thinking. And it's, if you have not invested, perhaps that thought comes to your mind as well. Now, let me tell you something. Whenever you buy a commercial property, fundamentally you need to check. You would always buy a tenanted property, means there is already lease in place and the tenants are already doing business there, right? So your tenant is already established and they're doing the business. Then the question that you will be asking, okay, if they're already established and there was a point where they came to this building to do the business, they must have seen something that we perhaps do not know, which is like they can do the business there, they can make money out of it and all sort of things. So what you need to understand, what you need to look into, that is this the same, or will this be the same in the future? Now, there are a lot of uncertainty as well, as I understand, but as long as you are buying this with all the fundamentals correct, then that fear you need to overcome by hand holding with another person. In this case, the buyer agent can help you, and as you know that we are the buyer agents, we have helped multiple people with this purchase process. So you need to go through that stage, that fear. So the number one fear is that I am not going to have a tenant and this tenant is going to move out. How to overcome? So logically, I always say that make sure that you have about 3 to 6 months worth of mortgage payments saved. And if you are buying a tenanted property and it is a positive cash flow, I'm pretty sure that from day one you do not need that positive cash flow. So keep that money aside, so that in the event if it ever happens, then you are sorted. Now, that actually logically or mathematically that you are calculating and keep that money aside, so that fear should be gone. And this is exactly that we do. Like, if one of my tenants, let's say, moves out, then finding another tenant, let's say it will take 3 months or 6 months, I should not be pressurized to sell that property, simply because I have that buffer. And I want you to think about that as well and put that buffer so that you are not stressed enough to sell that property. Similar range, that the fear is, okay, I have a 3 years lease, but what if the tenant actually moves out midway without paying rent? Now, this is how you need to understand a little bit more about commercial property lease, because generally speaking, if the lease has a personal guarantor or corporate guarantor, or more importantly, that the company itself is strong financials, that they have to honor the lease. If they do not, then you can actually chase them up and you can recover the whole number of years lease worth of rent. And that is possible in commercial property, which is not possible in residential property. Now, let me give you an example. Let's say you signed a residential tenancy for 1 year, and in that 1 year, after 2 months, you say, sorry, I cannot pay the rent. And because the residential is heavily regulated, and as you know that it is like the NCAT or QCAT or VCAT, depends on which state you are, they are going to protect as a tenant. Whereas in commercial property, it is not the case, because it's the business. So if you have signed a lease for a 3 years, that means as a tenant, you are committing that 3 years. If you are not, then the landlord can, through the help of lawyers, can claim that and go to the court and pretty much recover that whole money. Now, the other thing also that you need to look into is that when you are signing the lease, there is something called bond or security deposit. Now, this bond and security deposit for commercial property, there is no such rule. You can ask for 6 months, 12 months worth of bond or security deposit if you desire so as a landlord. And there is no such rule, as long as the landlord and tenant agrees, that's the rule. So which is why the lease that you write, make sure that you understand that lease. And if you're buying a leased property, make sure you know how to read all these clauses and pretty much buy things which is according to the rules and buy things which is in the favor of landlord. And which is why again the buyer agent can help you to go through this. Now, lease review can also be done by a professional like lawyer, and if they know what they're doing. So if you are buying the property on your own, make sure that you hire a qualified lawyer who understands these property laws and pretty much guide you, saying that okay, yes, this makes sense, or this is the clause which can prevent you to increase the rent further, or there is a CPI increase, this is not a triple net lease, and all sort of things that they can guide you. So make sure that you go through this. So that's another fear that you can overcome by buying that property right. And the last but not the least is the fear of tenant actually stop paying rent but they continue living or doing business in that property. Now, this fear actually comes from a residential point of view, because in residential property, if you have a tenant and that tenant is not paying rent and they are not moving out, then you need to go to that NCAT or QCAT or VCAT. But at the same time, the laws says that you can't, because it's a bit of emotional thing, right? People are living in the house, otherwise they would be on the street, and government has a backing to make sure that doesn't happen. So which is why it is, as I always say, that when it comes to the residential property, it is always tenant friendly lease. It is always tenant will have the favor, and you as a landlord kind of a mercy that okay, yes, I'm getting the rent, means it's a big thing. Whereas in commercial property is slightly different, because commercial property there is no government kind of interference. If the tenant is not paying, you can straight away terminate the lease and you can claim the bond. If they're continuously staying there, then of course you can evict them straight away. Now, that generally doesn't happen. Think about this. If business is staying there and not paying rent, is basically means that they are making money, right? Why would they continuously operating from that location if they're not making money? And if they're making money, why wouldn't they pay rent? So it's slightly different than the residential property. Residential property, in case like let's say the people, they lost their job but they still have to live in the property, because otherwise they will be on the street. Whereas in commercial property, that's not the case. Like if you are operating from that premise, it means that you are making money, right? It might be the profit might not be that much, there would be downturn, but they're still making money. So they would be trying their utmost capacity to pay the rent so that they do not get evicted from that place and stop doing the business, because remember, that's their livelihood is also on that business. Particularly sole traders or mom and dad kind of business, they would always try to be in that place. And that's the fundamental difference, because in commercial property, if you understand that, then those fears can be like mitigated. And these are the fears that people generally have when you do not have that knowledge and skills. And I highly recommend you to learn more. By all means, come to our webinar. We regularly talk about these commercial properties. So go and to our website www.mlina.com.au and register yourself to our webinars, where we regularly bring new content and understand that how you can be equipped to understand more about commercial property. So these are the fears. Which fear do you have? Put in the comment section.